Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Trilling, an attorney in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection at the Federal Trade Commission. Our second panel this morning is going to build on the discussion from panel one and get a little bit more into detail about how to integrate security into the development pipeline after you've taken some steps such as threat modeling that was discussed on panel one. I'm pleased to have three panelists who have a wealth of experience with software development and security in a variety of settings. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, and you can find additional biographical information about each of them in the official conference materials. First, Julian Dunn is a product manager at Chef, a company that provides tools for system and application configuration management. Julian has more than 15 years of systems administration, product development, and engineering management experience in diverse industry sectors such as advertising, broadcasting, internet security, and video hardware. In the middle, we have John Heasman, Senior Director of Software Security at DocuSign, a company that provides electronic signature technology and digital transaction management services. At DocuSign, John supervises functions such as threat modeling, code review, and security training for developers. He previously spent a decade as a lead penetration tester with the NCC group, where he consulted for software vendors and financial institutions, and he has published and spoken extensively about security issues. And finally, on the far end, Pat Lamphere is Director of Security and Compliance at Socrata, a company that leads open data initiatives to enable government clients to make data publicly accessible and usable. He has experience working in information security for companies ranging from startups to the Fortune 10, and his experience includes building and running a team that successfully hunted for advanced persistent threat actors at Microsoft. So to kick things off for panel two, Julian, can you describe in general what it means to integrate security into the development pipeline?
Sure, Jim. Tara in the first panel did mention the notion of doing rapid releases, and I think it's fairly common today to do what is known as, how many folks know what continuous integration is and continuous delivery? So these practices are often intended to provide basically businesses the ability to deliver customer features very, very quickly, right, as opposed to the way in which you would have done work before, which is deliver quarterly or yearly releases to get features out the door. And back in those days when you were delivering releases more infrequently, the common practice of doing security and compliance checking was to do this sort of at the end of a pipeline, right? So application developers would do their work, a thing would get into a production or often a pre-production environment, and there would be some kind of security review. Or if you were lucky, or if you were unlucky, what would happen is the application would simply get deployed directly into production, and then later on some findings would happen, or some security auditors would come along and basically scan the production systems and find all kinds of flaws, right? Unfortunately, at that time, you've already exposed the business to a significant amount of risk. So the idea is, integrating this kind of work into the development pipeline means being able to test not only from the beginning of when you design the application, not from an architecture perspective, but through a sort of dev test pre-prod environment, have assertions and have those kinds of checks built right into the system instead of trying to do it at the end and add security to the end of the work product.
So, John, do you have anything to add on that in terms of explaining why continuous delivery and continuous integration can be beneficial when it comes to security?
Yes. When you're shipping code frequently, it gives you a great opportunity to add telemetry to your code. So, for example, if you're fixing a particularly complex issue, you can add some telemetry, gather data on who exactly is using that feature, how they're using it, and then you can use that to guide your decisions on how to address certain issues. Just the ability to address issues as they come up, rather than, as Julian said, waiting till the end to shoehorn them in, just it generally improves things.
Pat, can you provide some examples of instances in which you've seen that continuous delivery and continuous integration help provide cost savings and efficiencies when it comes to security?
Yeah, for us, we run everything in 2-week sprints, which I think is pretty much the norm for agile shops around here. And so when things do crop up and security issues do come up all the time, there's always going to be something, right? It's a lot easier to get things on the backlog and get things addressed if you've got you've got 2-week sprints and a 6-week full cycle. Than it is to get things on the backlog when you've got a year-long or more development cycle for a major product release. So when things do come up, it's a lot easier to just go to the PM who owns that and say, hey, I need some time on your next sprint or the sprint after that to take care of this issue or that issue or things like that. And get things addressed a lot more quickly and cohesively than it does, again, with the monolithic style of management.
If a startup wants to lay the groundwork for including security into an environment of continuous delivery, continuous integration, how should it get started? John, do you want to start on that?
I feel there's good news and bad news here. The bad news is there's a lot of things that need to get done. So referring back to the first panel, you need to have start building a culture of security. That incorporates some training. You need to do threat modeling. And then let's think about some of the tools you might run. You need to run static analysis tools, dynamic analysis tools. You need security-focused code reviews. You need monitoring of your code in production. You might have penetration testing and bring in external consultants. So there's a lot of different areas. And the other part of the bad news is there's not a single area where you can say, well, let's just put all of our investment in that one area. Let's spend all of our budget on a dynamic analysis tool, and that will solve all of our problems. Unfortunately, security really doesn't work that way. And so you really have to put some thought into a lot of different areas. I guess the good news is that even just doing anything, a small amount of effort in each of those areas can really yield huge dividends. So you start doing threat modeling. It's not perfect at the start, but it's something. It catches some bugs, and that saves you a lot of money.
Can we unpack that a little bit? So you mentioned working from the threat model, and you mentioned static analysis, dynamic analysis, security-focused code reviews. Is there a sequential formula that these different tasks should be implemented in? Does it depend on the particular company and the results of its threat modeling process?
I think it's universally agreed that threat modeling is the first step. And as was discussed on the previous panel, it's never really too early to start thinking about security and doing threat modeling. That said, I've certainly seen a lot of cases where teams will come to me and they've built a prototype. They may even have actually want to ship some code. They haven't actually done the threat model, and so you kind of have to work things in reverse a little there. But once you can get the teams on board with coming to you early and getting the threat model done as soon as possible, everything can stem from there. Typically, out of a threat model, I look for two things. We want to catch any design bugs. Those are extremely costly to fix once we've actually started writing code. And they only get more expensive the further you get through the pipeline. If you're fixing bugs that you've actually shipped to production, that's hugely expensive. So I look to catch design bugs. And then I look to identify areas that we should review in more detail. So 2 action items: catch the design bugs and have a list of target areas for either a deep dive code review or fuzzing or maybe even bringing in external consultants to help us.
And in terms of catching design bugs, what tools or what processes can a company implement to efficiently catch the design bugs?
Well, I mean, threat modeling, that is the essence of threat modeling. that you can go through the design there. One thing I would say on threat modeling, to reiterate a comment that came up on the previous panel, threat modeling for a lot of developers can be a kind of scary, intimidating process. You download the Microsoft tool. It's a great tool. But if you just say to a dev with no background information in threat modeling, produce a threat model using this tool, they'll either just have a really weak attempt at it, or they'll stay up all night and then produce something that isn't really what you asked for anyway. They'll be stressed about that. So what we've done at DocuSign is we say to the developers, produce a data flow diagram. Here's some resources if you don't know what a data flow diagram is, but use the graphical part of the threat modeling tool to show us the data flows for the feature you've built. Now, every developer should be able to do that. They're designing the feature, so that should be fairly easy for them. And then we will help them work through the threats. We're not asking the developers to come to a meeting having a fully prepared, beautiful threat modeling solution. Just get the data flow diagram done, and we'll help you from there.
When it comes to static analysis, Pat, can you talk about what sorts of tools a company might turn to for static analysis and what the company should expect to achieve from static analysis?
It really depends on what you're coding in, what language you're coding in. Some languages have a lot more tools available than others. If you're in straight Java, C, C#, anything in Visual Studio, essentially, there's a lot of tools and options out there, both open source and even as a service. Veracode comes to mind on the last one there. When you start to get to less popular programming languages like Scala, which, to use the example that we code in, the options become a lot more limited in what's out there and what's available. So it really depends on what languages you have and what you're working with. But I would start out with. Especially, you don't need to go out and spend a lot of money on a static code analysis package or anything like that. I would start with just the tools that have been released by Microsoft if you're a Visual Studio shop, and leverage those to start with. Otherwise, you can start looking into some of the commercial options, but straight out the gate, I'm not quite sure if it's going to be worth your money.
I also wanted to mention, there's also, in addition to the static analysis tools, by the way, would inspect your object code or your source code and look for common patterns of things that you might be doing wrong. But, one of the other important things to keep in mind is the dependencies upon which your custom application is being built, right? And so you have this notion of a software supply chain where if you're building a car, right, you're going to source a bunch of components, your doors, your windows from a number of suppliers. And so you want to have that kind of discipline with respect to your software products as well, right? And making sure that when developers, they're downloading, be it like a Java or Scala kind of application, that when they're downloading
Ruby
jar
gems.
files, but dependencies from the internet, that those dependencies aren't, older versions that are known to have vulnerabilities, or perhaps even current versions that perhaps are kind of risky, right? And so to have some kind of process or tooling that looks at that kind of stuff and makes sure that it's actually sane is really good. And one thing that we've looked at before is the Sonatype Nexus lifecycle auditor suite of products, which basically would integrate right into a developer's development environment and be able to look at their project when they're first starting it, right? And what libraries are they using, but then on an ongoing basis, when they reopen that project to work on it, right, it can connect to the internet and download lists of vulnerabilities and match them against whether or not any of those vulnerable versions are being used in that project, and alert them and say, all right, so in order for you to get a non-vulnerable version with the same sort of API compatibility, you need to be at least on this version, or maybe you should consider upgrading to the next major one because this older one isn't maintained or what have you. So those sorts of tools are extremely valuable, I think, for going to where the developers are comfortable, right, which is in their development environment, integrating it right in there.
Is static analysis something that companies should be doing on an ongoing basis as changes are made to code?
I think if you can, sometimes it can be very expensive to do that. I don't mean necessarily from a monetary standpoint, right? But for a project of a non-trivial size, it can be computationally intensive. So I don't think just like as John was pointing out, this in order to actually achieve security across broad life cycle of your application, you can't simply do one thing, right? There's it's a broad investment. It's not a deep investment, right? So this is one of those areas in which I think running it regularly is definitely of benefit, but it can't just be just blindly apply it to everything, and that's the only way in which you're sort of ensuring security.
And if we can back up just one step, can you explain what happens in static analysis, John?
Sure. So static analysis is programmatic analysis of your code to find security vulnerabilities. And that's as opposed to dynamic analysis, which is you've got your live product and you have some other tool that's firing requests against that product. So static analysis consumes your source code or your compiled object code, and it attempts to identify where input comes into your application and then trace that input through as it flows through your application, and then identify they're called sinks, places where untrusted user input can reach a sink, and that's a vulnerability. So as an example with SQL injection, a sink would be the library that does the database call, and the source of the data would be some, say, web page that takes a parameter from the user. And if the static analysis tool can identify that data flows from the source, as in from the user, all the way to the sink without sufficient validation, then the static analysis tool will claim it's found a SQL injection vulnerability. And so static analysis, it has the benefits that you run it on your source code. It can do this analysis in some cases better than humans. It can do it at scale, and you get a nice set of results. The downside of this approach is this technology has only really sort of hit the mainstream in the last decade or so, and it is still very much work in progress. So that nice set of results is actually thousands of results. I ran it recently on a project within DocuSign, and it found literally 5,000 results. And it was an extremely intensive triage process to manually go through those thousands of results. And we reduced the number of real bugs down to, I think it was between 10 and 20. So that gives you an example of the number of false positives that these tools will throw up. And that is a huge problem. So if as a startup you invest in static analysis, you've got to ask yourself, well, do we have the manpower even to analyze these results? Because if all of your dev and test are tied up analyzing static analysis results, you're then invariably neglecting other areas that you should be spending time on.
And dynamic analysis, when you roll that out, it just kind of piles on. I've seen, 5,000 page reports come out of Rational App Scan and things like that are just page after page after page of false positive. And sometimes there's a nugget in there, and sometimes there isn't. But it's extremely costly to wade through that mess.
How can a startup in particular determine what is a false positive when they get the type of voluminous output that you're mentioning, either through static or dynamic analysis?
So how we do it is actually break it down on the input field. And so, we know where the inputs are in our applications and what those discrete inputs are. So we'll start taking each one of those inputs and say, supposedly we've got 47 different variants of different types of SQL injectors or cross-site scripting or something. We'll try it out. And then we'll also go back and just say, hey, team X, you're responsible for this piece of code. Can you double check the input sanitization there? And if we're not able to reproduce and the code looks good from an input sanitization perspective there, we'll just kind of, okay, everything that's on that input, I'm going to mark these as false positives and move on, because I don't have time to sit there and go one after the other after the other.
I would add that some good advice starting out is to simply ignore anything that's not a critical or high vulnerability. That immediately reduces the number that you need to triage. And then over time, a lot of these tools have the ability that once you've gone through that process once and suppressed issues as false positives, they won't show up again. So the hope is that over time, the amount of work that you need to do each time you run the tool diminishes, but there is a huge amount of work that you need to do that initial time.
Who in the organization should be involved in reviewing the output of these static analysis or dynamic analysis tests and doing the work to eliminate the false positives?
I feel that it has to be somebody that knows the code. It doesn't matter what team that person works on. Are they a dev? Are they in a security team if you have one? Are they in test? Just as long as they know the code and they know it well. The better they know it, the faster they can triage issues, and then they can take those issues to the devs.
And I think this was touched on in the first panel too, which is like even from the very early stages of your startup, having and identifying and hiring folks that have an interest in security as being part of their job. I mean, just if you're a very small company, having a separate security team or the only engineer that takes care of security is kind of the wrong approach, right? Like everybody's gotta be thinking about this as part of, it's another, security in my mind is another aspect of quality, and as an engineer, right, you want to be writing the highest quality code that you can. And fundamentally, I mean, if you're not, sort of incorporating that as part of your own quality processes as an engineer, that's kind of, doesn't make you a very good engineer. So we caution against kind of isolating this off into one person's job or what have you.
Are there specific tools that you might call attention to when it comes to dynamic analysis? Any of the three of you?
Honestly, the best value bang for the buck we've got on dynamic analysis is actually setting up a bug bounty program. Because now I've got script kiddies all around the world who for $25 whole are willing to sit there and beat on my test site all day long and find all the cross-site scripting, find all the CSRF. They've even found a couple actually kind of sexy ones, some XXE and things like that, we've paid money to some of the very expensive consulting shops here in town that couldn't find. And so for I think my total outlay, I just checked it, has been $5,200 over the last year or so since we fired up our bug bounty program, versus I've paid probably $250,000 to professional pen testers, and I've gotten 4 mediocre vulns out of the professional pen testers, and I've got several hundred decent quality vulns out of the bug bounty program. So for me, that's more bang for the buck than going out and paying Veracode, running Rational, running all the different tools. That's been a huge ROI for us.
For those who may not be familiar, can you just briefly say what a bug bounty program is and how you've implemented your program at Socrata?
Sure. So bug bounty program is basically you're going out there to the world and saying, I'm going to pay you to find vulnerabilities on my platform and in my software. And you set a range, you set the rules. I have had people in the bug bounty program that don't follow the rules, and I say, thank you for the vuln, I'm not paying you. But you do set the ground rules. We pay anywhere from $2,500 to $1,500 based on the severity of the bug. There are a number of companies out there right now that will help you set up and run your program. Bugcrowd, HackerOne are the two that come top of mind. We went with Bugcrowd, but the way the market is going out is basically they take 20% off your rewards pool as their profit, and then they set up the site and help interface with all the security researchers for you. So. Again, for us, it's certainly been the biggest bang for the buck.
I think that also works really well if you have a SaaS kind of hosted application with a public site and a public application. And I think for more enterprise software, such as like the industry that we're in, I mean, you are often stuck with these firms, like a Rapid7 or whatever, that's going to be scanning your application, right? There's no way around it. There's no kind of bug bounty for that.
And dynamic analysis, is there a distinction in terms of when it's most useful or how frequently dynamic analysis should be done vis-a-vis what your comments on static analysis?
I would say at least once a release for dynamic analysis, but I definitely echo Patrick's comment that just like static analysis, it can produce an insane number of findings. So you've got to be careful that you don't get weighed down reviewing those.
We've got it actually built into our build process, so the build server will kick off a dynamic analysis tool and get the results every time that a new build is created.
I just wanted to point out, we're Chef is more of an infrastructure software company, and one of the other approaches that we're kind of taking in terms of software design and things as a countermeasure to these sort of scanning reports that generate, reams of data is providing a toolkit for you to describe your policy, and it's more infrastructure-oriented policy today. It's called InSpec. It's totally free. You can look it up on GitHub. But it allows you to describe what is your correct policy, for your compliance regime, or even just what your own security policy is, and then just run those rules in advance. It's much easier to kind of do that and run your defined policy rather than just trying to scan a thing and try to sift through the morass of the data that it provides to figure out what's actually on fire.
That's a good segue into another topic that I want to cover. Are there tools that likely are already being used in the development process that can also be leveraged as part of thinking about security?
There certainly are. It was mentioned in the first panel the importance of building security tests into your testing framework as early as possible. A lot of companies, especially if they're only just starting to take a strong stance on security, they might already have a testing framework, not for security purposes, just to test their product actually works. With a few tweaks, you can really leverage what you've already built to do security testing. So that's definitely one area I think is very valuable. And then secondly, I would say telemetry. I'd never really thought about telemetry too much when I worked as a penetration tester. I reviewed tons of people's code and never really paid too much attention to the logging. But since working at DocuSign, I've really realized the value that telemetry can provide you. So as a startup, you're frequently shipping code, you're frequently shipping prototype code, you're partnering with companies and developing partner integrations, and so pretty quickly you're shipping a whole bunch of code and a whole bunch of products and features. And some of those prototypes may not come to fruition, some of those deals may fall through, but you're probably still shipping some code that you don't need to. And so telemetry, if you built in a good telemetry system, I mean, even just using something standard logging packages, Log4j, and then using Logstash and Kibana to actually make sense of that data. Telemetry can provide you answers to interesting questions. Who exactly is still using this feature? So at DocuSign, we were able just simply to turn off some old prototype code that we'd been shipping for a while, but nobody was even using anymore. And that mitigated against any vulnerabilities in that code. And also, when you discover a vulnerability, the ability to then use that telemetry to say, has anyone else found this issue, is extremely invaluable. So you probably already have logging in your code for diagnostics. So think about how you can extend that for security purposes. One caveat I would say there, you've got to be careful when you're logging data, who has access to the data that you've logged, and what exactly are you logging? So are you logging PII? Are you logging secrets, like passwords? And the answer is you probably shouldn't be logging any secrets that would allow somebody to gain access to somebody else's account. And whether logging PII is acceptable or not depends on who has access to that data and your internal policies.
I think John's point is very valuable about the telemetry in that, a lot of the types of logging that you might be doing for system diagnostic purposes can be leveraged for security purposes as well. So for example, if you're just getting technical errors within an application, it could be very valuable to log, well, why did that error occur? What was the data payload? I mean, presuming you're not also logging the PII, but if you're logging sort of what the request body was or things like this, right, it can help you be a leading edge indicator for potentially security flaws or even just a defect within your software. Not that somebody's necessarily trying to hack you or what have you, right? But it could help you identify, patterns and defects of traffic that people are, pushing against your application, and that can lead you into digging further into the code and seeing, is that just a defect or is there actually a security vulnerability there? So I think I definitely encourage, some developers say, they when they're trying to get an application, especially new applications at the door, they don't think of logging. They think of logging as kind of a luxury or a frill, especially if they're not the ones that have to operate the thing. But there are other benefits beyond just the operability aspects, and I think it touches right into security for why logging, I think, is a prerequisite for good applications going out to production.
And there's an open source project released by the OWASP Foundation called App Sensor, which is essentially a framework for security logging and aggregation for actually data generated from within your application. So a lot of companies have good logging at the OS level, at the firewall level, but they're really completely blind to what's happening within their applications. So App Sensor sets out to provide you an easy framework that you can make sense of what's happening inside your application.
Yeah, and the baseline we use is we want to be able to recreate a session from beginning to end, every action taken by the user and every action taken by each component or subcomponent of the application. That's our baseline minimum for the amount of detail we log. We do get some PII in there, especially the definition of PII is getting wider and wider, so we use the email address as the primary ID. That's PII now. So a lot of times you can't avoid it. But at the same time, I would rather err on the side of having the detail in the logs and have to take some extra steps to protect my logs than to be sitting there going, I'm missing this step, and I'm not sure how we got from A to D because I can't see B and C because we filtered those.
Also, I would say that there's one other tool or approach that I have found very valuable is being able to wrap that application using something like a web application firewall. A lot of these content delivery networks will provide these to you today. If you're a startup and you're on AWS, which many startups are, they have a product, and it basically sits in front of your application and then pattern matches the requests that are coming in from real life users from the real traffic flows and can alert you if there's suspicious activity from that, right? So that's much more of a proactive approach than sort of this approach of like the blind scanning that generates a lot of data, right? Being able to model against real traffic flows of people that are using your application, I think is very valuable.
What tools are available to help manage the volume that may exist in logs that can help with identifying security issues that help manage the review of the logs? John, is App Sensor useful for that purpose? Are there other tools?
App Sensor is really the framework for collecting that data. The nice thing about App Sensor is it's highly configurable, lots of connectors, so you can store that data in a relational database, SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, or you can store that in a NoSQL database or flat files. I've most commonly seen it used with Logstash and Kibana. Kibana is a tool for visualizing logged data, but App Sensor is more just the framework for collecting that data.
So yeah, if you're going the open source route, Logstash, Kibana, and Elasticsearch on top also makes your life a lot easier. When you want to start paying money, then you've got the Splunks of the world, Sumo Logic, and then you can also get into the SIM vendors, bring a dump truck full of money for ArcSight and the likes of those. There is an open source SIM product that came out at Alien Vault that is kind of a good starter one. They even have an AMI you can spin up on AWS that's free, just to kind of get a feel for it. You'll probably outgrow it fairly quickly, And of course, it's a freemium model, but still, just to get your feet wet and start looking at the logs and playing with them. And if you don't have the bandwidth or technical acumen to stand up a Logstash Kibana cluster,
There's also appliances for that kind of stuff in AWS as well if you don't want to do it yourself. The great thing about these products is it makes it really, really easy for developers and folks that don't necessarily want to sift through a lot of data to be able to generate aggregate queries, because that's really fundamentally what you're looking at, right? Traditional logging products that just give you 1,000 lines of log format you need to look through. That's not particularly helpful. What you're looking for is patterns, right? And the ability to have Splunk or Elasticsearch be able to very easily, somebody that's could be even non-technical, be able to enter and understand how to write a query, looking for data points of interest and seeing how frequently they happen. I mean, that's really the value that these kinds of tools provide you.
You'll always have the hardcore developer who grep is love, grep is life. But after about 6 months, we've even managed to flip those over to using our log management solution, because you can do the queries across different boxes and different services.
You can set alerts as well on queries that you've pre-written. So for example, if you're looking for something that hasn't shown up yet, but you think that this type of thing, you want to be notified if somebody triggers a certain thing in the future, right? If you suddenly have an elevated, rate of internal server errors or what have you, what kind of characteristics, right? These products will let you set those as canned queries and be able to let you, if the number of log lines reaches a certain threshold, to be paged or emailed or whatever, right? So just operational tools that can help you be a little bit more proactive with your security practices.
When it comes to acting on issues that are identified either by running static analysis or dynamic analysis or reviewing logs, what tips do you have in terms of how to act on those issues when they're identified?
There's nothing I hate more than playing whack-a-mole with a bug. So when a bug comes in, the worst case scenario is you fix the bug, and then 3 or 6 months later, somebody else might find a similar bug, very, very similar bug, the same bug, just in a different piece of code internally, and you fix that. And then 6 months later, somebody externally reports a bug to you, and lo and behold, it's that same bug in a different place. So what we really strive to do when we have a bug, no matter how we found it internally, from a tool, reported to us by a customer, somebody else, we really try and identify all instances of that bug, all instances of similar bugs, and then figure out how can we eliminate that bug, that class of bug, from our code base, and how can we prevent it ever coming back into our code base. Now, there's different ways we can do that. It might just be we run some clever search query on our code, find all instances of it, and just manually then go and fix all of those instances. Or we might take an approach of writing what we call a safe library. So if there's a piece of code, some component that our developers are frequently misusing, or that component has insecure default settings, then we'll write some wrapper code that instantiates it in a safe way, and then mandate that all of our developers use that safe version. To give you an example, a common vulnerability when processing XML data, XML Entity Injection, allows, if an attacker can control the XML, they can do all kinds of nasty things, potentially read files off disk, make network calls, lots of possibilities for denial of service. And so a lot of the XML parsers in frameworks in Java and C# are vulnerable by default. So this is one that could be widespread across your code base because developers just never knew. They just instantiated the library, the object, according to the documentation, and they were vulnerable by default. So it's a prime candidate to write a wrapper around it, a safe library, so that we instantiate it with safe settings. And then we actually went through our code and programmatically replaced all instances where we were creating the vulnerable object with the safe library. And then you can even take that a step further. Your build process, you can, or check-in process rather, you can actually have a set of rules that now analyze the code and prevent developers checking in code that uses the original unsafe object. They just get a message back that it failed and that they need to, here's the reason it failed, you're using this, you should be using this safe library instead. So yes, it's an investment to build the safe library. You have to have a developer working on that particular feature, but then you can be safe that you've eliminated a whole class of vulnerability.
Pat, do you have anything to add in terms of taking the results from tests or observations and logs and communicating back to developers to get to the point of being able to fix the vulnerabilities that have been identified?
Right, and to build off what John said, we do track things by category and type of bug and try to say, okay, are we getting a lot of, XSS, for example, or something like that from this team or that team that shows they're really not following best practices, or there's something is failing that's causing these entire categories of vulns to be there, Okay, so we've got some technical debt and a number of things. Okay, those all fall into session management. And session validation. We've got that on the roadmap. We're going to fix that. But starting to look at, the other classes of vulnerabilities, and sometimes it's a technology fix. You can put in a safe library codes, things like that. But other times it is a training issue for your devs. And so sitting down and, they brought this up in the first panel, the importance of training. And yeah, Microsoft does have all the SDL stuff online. It can be very intimidating. The good news is Adobe has put their entire training program online as well. And the nice thing about the Adobe training is they do have all these CBT videos from beginning security for developers 101 all the way up to pretty advanced subjects online for free. Those are sitting at training.safecode.org. The only bad thing I have to say about them is they need to hire a better voiceover artist, but the content is good, the quality is good, and they're broken up into accessible chunks, so your devs aren't going to sit there and have their eyes glaze over. So worth your time, worth your effort, especially if you're trying to just roll out an introductory training program for your teams.
There's also nothing like feeding your own vulnerabilities back into your own training program, right?
Yep.
It really reifies the thing for people that, okay, well, this is all very nice in the abstract, but here's where we actually went wrong. Here's how we fixed it, right?
And taking the vulns and as we said earlier, sitting down with the developers, the people that know the code, and having them go through it, it can be really an educational experience for those developers and you can see the light bulb come on. It's like, oh, okay, that's why this is happening. We did this over here, and so they get that actual real world hands-on experience of why they shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, to build on that point, that's I've often seen, especially when I worked as a consultant and handed off some bugs to, say, somebody on the security team, a disconnect between how that information was then passed to developers. So the person I handed the bugs to didn't necessarily know the code. They understood the information I was providing them, but they didn't know the code. They would then hand it off to developers who didn't understand the issue but knew the code. So there'd be this disconnect where, and oftentimes I saw that the fix they then produced, it really reflected that point. The developer had interpreted the finding in his or her own particular way and hadn't really addressed the issue. So they sort of partly addressed it, but not fully. So you have to really make sure that disconnect doesn't happen and the developer fully understands the issue, understands and gets to the point where they can say, oh, well, actually, I wrote some other code that might be vulnerable to something similar.
We've touched on this a little bit, but thinking about the roles that the three of you have played both within organizations of different sizes and consulting for organizations of different sizes, can you talk at all in terms of the tips you would have for startups and small businesses in terms of deciding when to turn to a vendor versus handling aspects of security, testing, and remediation in-house?
If you've got the skills in-house, leverage them. But if you don't have the skills in-house and you've never done it before, muddling through, you're not going to be successful. So it's worth getting someone in, going off to training, going to the cons, take the time, go to Vegas in August. I know it's the worst time of year, but get that education, get that training for your staff. There's a B-Sides coming up on the 20th over in Redmond. That's going to be very worthwhile for some of your dev staff. That's more of a application security focused conference, and it's cheap. And just really start building those skills in house. But if you don't have the skills in house and you're not sure what you're doing, it's going to be much cheaper for you in the long run to pay someone now to bring you up to speed.
In particular, crypto is an area that springs to mind. Most companies do not have the expertise in-house to design a system that uses crypto. So that would definitely be an area that as a startup I would want, even if I thought I'd done a good job, I would want external validation from experts that say, yes, this is correct.
Yeah, and if you can, I mean, obviously don't try to invent that stuff yourself, right? Number one.
Never roll your own algorithm.
Yeah, never roll your own crypto. Never roll your own concurrency library either. Number two, you're hosting your application somewhere in an infrastructure provider, right? And as I sort of pointed out, with the web application firewall discussion, if you're hosting in Amazon or Azure or any of these kind of public cloud providers, if you don't have the time to solve these kinds of things yourself, often these folks have tools, right, and very low-level tools that you just plug into. I mean, you have got to trade that off, obviously, against like potentially if you're concerned about vendor lock-in or whatever. But they're kind of like canned solutions for things like secrets management, key management. Like it's kind of undifferentiated heavy lifting that as a startup you're out there trying to provide value in some other way, like building your own cryptography system or secrets management system doesn't add value whatsoever to your core value proposition, right? So using something that you already have, you're familiar with from that platform, is a good way to get into it and make sure that you just, it's somebody else's problem to deal with that strong crypto.
And as we wrap things up to be able to head toward questions, can you talk a little bit about root cause analysis was mentioned on the first panel. Can you talk a little bit about performing root cause analysis and how companies can utilize root cause analysis to sort of get out of the cycle of seeing the same vulnerabilities pop up repeatedly?
I like to think of bugs as examples of an anti-pattern. So developers are all familiar with various patterns. An anti-pattern is something that hopefully your developers won't be using writing their code that has associated vulnerabilities. So we like to take those bugs and abstract them to what's the anti-pattern here, and then educate the developers on that anti-pattern, and then think about how can we, are our scanning tools good enough to pick up this anti-pattern? If not, how can we improve those? The thing I would say about the static analysis tools we talked about earlier, they're all extensible. If you're willing to spend the time, you can actually write your own rules for the static analysis tools. And that can actually be quite beneficial for, say, representing an anti-pattern and then using the static analysis tool to find all instances of it.
I also wanted to mention that, I don't know if this was brought up in the first panel, I missed a little bit of it, but there's a cultural aspect to this, and in order for this to work, these root cause analysis, if you will, I mean, they have to be done in a blameless way. I mean, I know the FTC with their video, puts the fear of God into you about how they're going to come after you if you're not secure, right? But at the end of the day, it's a learning opportunity for you, even if there is I wouldn't say going so far as a breach, right? But vulnerabilities and things like this in your code. I mean, you have to assume positive intent from your engineers. I mean, you didn't hire them. Presumably, you trusted them, and they didn't deliberately introduce these vulnerabilities into the system. They just didn't know necessarily the best coding practices or what have you, right? And so you've got to look at it as a positive thing when these sorts of things happen, right? So.
Yeah, one thing that we've been doing is especially once we've started doing the training and started working with the developers, you'll have the developers come to you and say, hey, I found this thing over here, I found this thing over here. And carrots always work better than sticks. So awesome, here's whatever reward you've come up with. Here, I'm going to throw some chocolate at you from across the room or whatever, just as a nice job, little kudos to say, you know what, you're on the right track, and let's keep doing some more of this.
Great, thank you. So we are actually ready to open the room up for questions.
So those of you who spoke about telemetry gathering and all the PII that contains, I'm curious how you, can you talk about the security due diligence you did on your telemetry libraries, especially since we know that a lot of them send all their data back in the clear?
So at DocuSign, we've built our telemetry system in-house completely, and the libraries take steps to prevent PII and secrets entering them, and then we have a whole bunch of queries that we run on an automated schedule to look for interesting looking things in the logs. So for example, a request containing something saying password, for example. And anytime one of those alerts fires, we then investigate, hey, do we have some sort of logging violation? But really it's a question of also obviously making sure that we then secure that data and that we have proper authorization on who can actually access that data.
So for us, we use Sumo Logic, and so it comes with a agent that performs a secure transport off the box to their service. The other option that they have that we also make use of is just writing down to an S3 bucket. So that's done over SSL for secure transport as well. So that's how we've got around it.
We've used New Relic in the past, which is very, very similar to a Sumo Logic type of thing. And you can also take countermeasures, like for example, one interesting thing is a lot of folks don't forget to set up egress firewall rules or egress from machines that are in a data center is like often completely open, and actually best practice as well, deny by default even on the egress, and so you can do things like only allow like secure ports outbound to certain collectors, for example, like New Relic or Sumo Logic collectors.
So my question is on the last bullet there, speak to developers in their language. Can you give us like do's and don'ts? So what should we do and what shouldn't we do when we talk to developers?
I think, as was sort of already mentioned, assigning blame and is obviously not the way forward. Really, every bug is a learning opportunity for the developer that wrote the code and everyone else in your organization. So those would be my main points. Just try and learn as much as you can from every bug.
Yeah, if you're a security person, you're working in a security department, I mean, folks have got to stop thinking of themselves as the police, coming after a developer. I'm going to hunt you down and find out what you did wrong. It has to be a collaboration.
Yeah, and getting to know your developers on a personal level, just to know, because different developers had a different approach will work with each one. We've got one particular developer that all I have to do is go over and said, hey, look what Java did this time. And he'll rant at Oracle for 20 minutes, and then we'll get started on finding the solution. But if I just come to him and say, hey, we've got this bug that I need you to address, even though it's not an attack or anything like that, he'll take it as a personal affront. So if we can blame shift a little bit, yeah. Even if it's not really accurate, sometimes you can get them to buy in quicker.
I'd also say it's incumbent on security people to understand the context in which the business operates, right? Like there's situations in which security people that just apply a set of canned rules about things that are insecure to a business, right? Not if that business or that application actually isn't really particularly high risk, right? Applying sort of Fort Knox level rules to a thing that's like a very internal kind of system, it's completely inappropriate and a waste of time and burns a bunch of goodwill for the times when you actually have problems that you actually need addressed by engineers.
Actually like to expand on that a little bit. Can you even get a little bit more granular in terms of if there is a separation in function between developers and those who are doing security testing and seeing the results? What is the most effective way to communicate those results back? Are there ways to utilize tools that the developers are using to communicate the needs for fixes? Do you have other suggestions?
I'm a product person, so of course I would love security folks to be able to know how to write user stories, for example, to describe security vulnerabilities, as opposed to throwing a set of PDFs or report to developers and being like, just take care of this, right? Like, there's got to be a common language, I think, between the two groups. So that's sort of what I would encourage. I mean, if there's security folks in the room, I'd love to talk more about that.
Yeah, exactly. You need to make it relatable for the developer. It can't just be the ridiculous report spit out by some tool. You've got to put it in their language and also a human readable language.
Yeah, developers want to see good repro steps and good notes on the bug. This is what's expected. This is what's happening. This is why it's an issue. And really that speaks to my earlier point about organizations can have this disconnect between the person that's talking to the developers saying, here's this bug, and then the developers not really understanding the bug. And I've definitely seen that with, Pentester provides report, give it to the developers, they don't really know what to do with it. It definitely needs to be a buffer there where somebody can actually understand the bug and work with the developer to make sure they fully understand it.
This question's in reference to Patrick stating that he's paying script kiddies $25 at a time to go through the bug bounty program. Do you feel like there's any way to possibly offer incentive for professional security researchers outside of a monetary commitment to get them to review the code and possibly find more bugs?
Well, I was being a little bit facetious there. The different bug bounty vendors actually have essentially pools or stables of professionals that they use. And so like when we launched, we did not launch publicly at first. We launched with a pool of 100 professionals. And then what you can also do is do limited scope bounties as well, where it's winner takes all. So we'll be doing another one of those coming up this quarter, where it's, you know what, we've got $10,000 in the prize pool, and whoever finds the biggest bug, you get a guaranteed $5K, and that really gets the whales to come out and makes it worth their time.
And is that just information that you disseminate on your website, or how does the program get communicated?
Right. So it's actually on our website. If somebody submits to our support portal, our support people know to redirect them, and it's also on the bug bounty vendor. We went with Bugcrowd, and so if you go to bugcrowd.com/Socrata, and then there's a couple different sites on the web that track all the different bug bounty programs. It's amusing. Bugcrowd and HackerOne both have pages that point to each other's programs. So it's certainly becoming more prevalent and better known.
Another quick question about getting good results from penetration testing, and that's if something like Bugcrowd isn't an option, and your results that you're getting from external consultants are maybe what you said, 4 mediocre results. When does it make sense? Does it ever make sense to have an internal pen test team? How do you develop that?
I think what you've got a bit critical mass as a company to be able to afford it, to be frank. I mean, quality pen testers are not cheap. And so for us, we've been able to get better value, and also putting on the hat when I was a consultant, a black box penetration test is never worth the time or the money. You want to sit down with your consultants ahead of time and do a complete brain dump on here's what the system is, here's how it's architected, here's the languages, here's the versions, everything you can possibly give them to empower them to be more effective. So if you're doing black box penetration tests, which is where the attacker knows nothing about the environment ahead of time, honestly, I think you're wasting your money. So you definitely want to do the white box. Here's the full detail. Here's the full brain dump. Here's access to GitHub. Anything and everything to empower them ahead of time, so that you're going to get the best value. And then when is it time for an internal penetration testing team? It depends on the business. It depends on the regulation. It depends on how much money you have. So yeah, I can't give a good answer for that.
I would also say try and get some continuity with the vendor you use. So at least some of the team have Then the next time you bring them in, there's some of the people that worked on the original test, get that continuity going so that there's some expertise that they learn how your applications work, so you're not just starting from scratch every time you bring people in.
We've actually switched vendors because the consultant was at a previous vendor and then he moved over. Because again, yeah, so we don't have to retrain somebody.
And we maybe have time for one more question if we have any other questions in the room. Okay, I think people must be ready for lunch. So with that, I want to thank our panelists.